Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. It is always a joy to be with you. I encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, whichever place you most prefer, or do it all if that is what floats your boat. We would love to continue to get to know you better and grow in relationship with you. And so I encourage you to check out the links in both our show notes and our YouTube description that tell you more about where you can connect with us elsewhere. The two big things we have going on besides the podcast is our shop that is full of reminders of who you are in God, helping you to really grow in that radical art of standing in who you are and giving gifts that help others to do the same. The other big thing we have going on is the Uprising Academy. This is all of our formation programs, workshops, retreats. Everything is available virtually and on demand, where you can sign up and continue to learn more about radically standing in what God says about you, especially if you are in a place in your life where you are not being fed the way that you long to be fed. Whether it's in your community, whether it's at your church, whatever it is, there is more for you, and we can absolutely walk with you into it through the Uprising Academy. All those links are in our show notes, and if you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to leave a review. Reviews are the number one way that we help get in front of new faces, new people that are able to be touched by the radical art of standing in what God says about us. I love you. I'm praying for you. I hope you have an amazing week. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jill Simons, and I'm so excited to grow in the radical art of standing in what God says about you with you today. The show is a place where we pour into the sense of who God is, who we are, and how we can live more in the freedom that He has for us every single day. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jill Simons, and I am so happy to be here with you today. This is a topic that I think is not talked about enough and is really, really important, is diving into really, how do you see God? What is true about Him? And looking at what you believe is true about God as really a starting point for everything else. Because a lot of times there's this push, not incorrectly, but maybe just kind of out of order, for this emphasis on relationship with God. Great. All for relationship with God. I would not do what I'm doing right now if I wasn't all about relationship with God. But since God is not a person that's sitting in front of you, I want to clarify what I just said. God is a person, but is not present sitting in front of you the way that a friend or spouse or child would be. It is a different thing to get to know Him. And the mechanics are all the same. He is, a person like all of those people, but we don't have that bodied experience. And we also don't have sometimes the clarity around who He is and what He says that we might have around another person. And so what happens is God becomes someone kind of vague that we just kind of apply ideas to. So for instance, I think that this happens with like celebrities too. They are not really people in our minds. We know that they are people, but we don't interact with them in the same mental space as like our real friends or people we actually know. And so we apply these characteristics to them. Maybe it's because, the characters they always play in a movie are a certain way, or, they are always associated with a certain kind of people that we believe something about. But we just kind of apply these things to them based on our perceptions and not based on what is true. And not that there can't be overlap, but our perceptions of them are so often detached from the reality of who they are. And I think that that's really similar to what happens with God, where we will develop these perceptions of God, will apply these things to him that isn't necessarily based on the truth of who he is, that could be based a lot more on just things that we apply to him. So when you look at what your image of God is, I always like to ask people, what is it that you know is true about God? What is it that like comes to your mind when you think of God? And this is an interesting exercise with people who are not people of faith as well, because what you find so often is that people's perception of God is what they don't like. So for instance, a lot of atheists have this idea that God is like a bully that just requires you to do what he wants, and he's a person, but he's just like the alpha male, and out of just kind of a rebellion, defiance, whatever, they just want to stand firm in, no, I'm absolutely not going to do what you're asking me to do, because in their mind there's like a power struggle there, and they're not comfortable with the idea of someone, anyone, even God, telling them what to do. And so this idea of like a omnipotent alpha male who just tries to like exert his will on other people is not the God that I believe in either. And that's actually a really interesting thing to explore. Where is this coming from? Where is this idea that God is this alpha male, just challenging to be in relationship with, coming from? And a lot of times you find that there has been a wound. There has been a person, a relationship, a perception, whatever it is, that kind of corrupted the image of God that they had. And so this is a helpful exercise. And actually, in one of my retreats, in Trusting God from a Place of Safety, which I'll link in the show notes, we have a whole section on this. And we actually have a chart that has a whole bunch of adjectives where you circle, which adjectives seem authentic to you to describe God. And there's a whole range of things, loving, present, absent, withholding, understanding, good, bad, neutral, all kinds of adjectives. And so when you go through and circle the ones that seem to fit your vision of God, it can be really revealing about where the wounds and issues are with your vision of God. And so it's very logical to think then this vision of God that you have, that's going to corrupt, or not necessarily corrupt, but at least touch every part of your faith life. And it's going to be very hard to progress in faith, grow in faith, even want to progress and grow in faith if your perception of God is such that he is mean, withholding, like cold, distant, all of these sort of negative attributes that you might have applied unintentionally to God somewhere along the line. And this is one of those classic situations where awareness is 8/10 of the battle, because a lot of people are going around with very hurt, warped visions of God, views of God, and aren't aware of it. They might be practicing Christians. They might be going to church every Sunday. They might be going through all the motions and wondering, gosh, I just can't really break through to the next level with God. But at the same time, I'm thinking that God is pretty awful. So why would I? Why would I break through to the next level with God? But so much of this is going on under the surface. And when it's unexamined, it's very hard to see what's going on there. And so that's my big invitation for you this week, is to examine what it is that you think is true about God, what is true about who you think God is. And that's going to be the place that everything else we do this quarter, this whole year, is going to flow from. Because if we don't get that piece right at the beginning, the whole puzzle is going to be like tilted off a little bit. I was building this huge display showcase with just this saint of a man that was, it's just so meticulous, so patient, measures 4 times, like literally the opposite of me. I'm like, oh, that looks close. Like, there's a reason that I don't do all of our production anymore. I do the one prototype that is, perfect and exactly how it should be. And then I hire people who are way more detail oriented than me to execute on it, because that's not where my strengths are. And so I was building this huge cabinet basically with him that was going to be a custom piece for us to be able to travel with to shows and show our products. And I got distracted when we were cutting like one of the first boards, and it shifted ever so slightly. And that shift got like exacerbated as we went through the process, to where the final product was off a little bit because of that just initial just that much off that we had been when we cut that board. And to me, I was like, it's fine, it's close enough. But to this very meticulous, again, saint of a man that I went through this process with, that was very frustrating to him the whole time. And that's what happens when we start from a first principle about God that's just not all the way there. We end up getting all the way to the end of the process, and we're still just not exactly where we could be, because we're working from, again, just first tools, raw materials that are just not quite what they should be. And so in terms of examining your relationship with God, I think one of the most powerful things to do is to just really actually sit and think about it. Ask yourself that question. Who do I think God is? What do I think is true about God? To journal with this, I grow more and more and more convicted about the power and importance of writing the older I get. Whether you are awful at it, whether you love it or hate it, it is just so helpful for self-reflection to be able to grow in actually knowing what you think, knowing yourself, and knowing what you think about God is one of those most fundamental things we just got to get right. We got to get figured out from the beginning. You could find a list of adjectives like the list I mentioned. If you want, you can also take the Trusting from a Place of Safety retreat that's linked in the show notes, where we go through this at length, talking about images of God, where they might have come from. And there's several exercises to help you really examine your image of God before you move into the rest of the work of really understanding how you trust God from a place of safety. And again, just the bedrock of that is knowing who God is and knowing who you think God is and whether or not that needs to change. Because this whole quarter, like I shared last week, is going to be spent talking about God's presence, God's real presence with us all the time. The fact that God is here, that we do not need to be lonely. We're not called into loneliness. We are called into communion and unity with Him at all times. But again, if we apply these bad, sometimes even evil character traits to the Lord, that's not a positive thing to think about Him being with us all the time. And where these come from a lot of times is from the other human beings in our life that have maybe been in that role. Someone who's been in a role of power in your life, maybe a role of parenthood, been in a role of like a teacher, an administrator, something like that, where they were that person to you, especially as a child. And so sometimes all of their characteristics, good, bad, in between, can get applied to God. And so then we're left with this image of like, oh my gosh, it's like Principal Schrader, looking over my shoulder all the time. And then God's presence, instead of being this source of peace and consolation and connection, becomes a source of anxiety and the source of stress and the source of, I don't even want to think about the fact that He's here because that sounds like too much. That's too heavy. I can't deal with that all the time. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to have the practice of the presence of God be an oppressive thing, because the true practice of the presence of God is never an oppressive thing. When we are aware of the fullness of who God is and that he's with us, there's always cause for joy. That is always cause for praise and celebration. But if we don't have that first piece of who he is, then it's always going to be just a little bit off. So that's your invitation for this week, is to really examine your image of God. And if it is less than a good, kind, loving, trustworthy father, then let's spend some time this week just really, again, becoming aware. What is it? We don't have to it needs to be different tomorrow, right now. Just awareness. What is it? Then once we have that, then we can use some real tools to work on retooling that view of God. And we're going to talk more about that as this quarter goes on. But for now, just notice, just awareness. What is it? Is it really in line with the God that we see revealed in the life of Christ? Or is it my own kind of amalgamation of people and character traits that I've decided that God has? Once you do that work, your world is going to open up, because as soon as you can get clear on who God really is, it becomes easier than ever to be aware of him and to enter into authentic relationship. So best of luck with your journey of awareness. I hope that you are able to really dig deep and see what it is that you have hidden in your heart on this front, and that's something that we can really work on and walk with together this year. I love you, and I hope you have a great week. I'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. It is always a joy to be with you. I encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, whichever place you most prefer, or do it all if that is what floats your boat. We would love to continue to get to know you better and grow in relationship with you. And so I encourage you to check out the links in both our show notes and our YouTube description that tell you more about where you can connect with us elsewhere. The two big things we have going on besides the podcast is our shop that is full of reminders of who you are in God, helping you to really grow in that radical art of standing in who you are and giving gifts that help others to do the same. The other big thing we have going on is the Uprising Academy. This is all of our formation programs, workshops, retreats. Everything is available virtually and on demand, where you can sign up and continue to learn more about radically standing in what God says about you, especially if you are in a place in your life where you are not being fed the way that you long to be fed. Whether it's in your community, whether it's at your church, whatever it is, there is more for you, and we can absolutely walk with you into it through the Uprising Academy. All those links are in our show notes, and if you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to leave a review. Reviews are the number one way that we help get in front of new faces, new people that are able to be touched by the radical art of standing in what God says about us. I love you. I'm praying for you. I hope you have an amazing week. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jill Simons, and I'm so excited to grow in the radical art of standing in what God says about you with you today. The show is a place where we pour into the sense of who God is, who we are, and how we can live more in the freedom that He has for us every single day.